Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nirmala Gopal, and I'm going to be facilitating today's exciting topic. On behalf of the Deputy Vice Chancellor for the College of Humanities, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, I welcome you all to one of the webinar presentations that forms part of the Transformation and Leadership Lecture Series in the College of Humanities. So the College of Humanities takes transformation really seriously. Of course, by now I'm sure that everyone's aware and familiar with today's topic, which is racial discrimination and how it plays itself as a disruptor to social cohesion. You know, I recall in February 1990, when I saw the late President Nelson Mandela walk down the famous street. And at that time, I said to myself, this is the end of apartheid. 26 years later, I realized that apartheid in some forms is still within and amongst us. So today we have a lineup of experienced individuals, both professionally and in terms of their activism in whichever sphere they belong to. We have 4 really experienced doyens. So therefore, I'm expecting the webinar to be robust and provocative. Our presenters, and I'm going to go through our presenters. The first presenter today is Professor Jeremy Seekings from the University of Cape Town. Our second presenter is Dr. Ella Gandhi from the Gandhi Development Trust. Then Professor Sipamandla Zondi from the University of Pretoria. And our final speaker, Pastor Michelle Tryon from Destiny Fulfilled Ministry. I am convinced that today the presentations will provoke and evoke a range of moods and feelings amongst us. And I want to allow you and invite you to own those feelings and own those moods. And let us see how we want to take the conversation forward. I'm going to look to you to give us advice on some intervention strategies. So this is the beginning of a journey. We have come to the stage where we have realized that conversations on race and racism, racial discrimination are important. And UKZN, as usual, has been bold enough to convene this webinar so that we can have honest and open discussions. With that, I'm going to hand you over to the first presenter, Professor Jeremy Seekings. He's a professor of political studies and sociology and the director for the Center of Social Science and Research at the University of Cape Town. Over to you, Professor Seekings.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Gopal. Am I operating my own PowerPoint, I think?
Yes.
I think that's right. So I'm going to, in a moment, just share a screen if all of this goes well. So I've got some PowerPoints, which I'm going to be speaking to. So let me just see if this works. All right. Now, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank
Okay,
you.
excellent. Good. All right. So, well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be joining you from Cape Town with the panel. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a, these are topics I study rather than I try through my own work really to redress so much. I'm a scholar rather than primarily rather than a doer. But I wanted to try and just share some of my thoughts about what social scientists really can bring to the table in understanding some of these issues. And particularly, I'm going to be focusing on what I'm going to just call for the moment racialized inequalities. I want to do 4 things. Whoops. Turns out, okay. Has my next slide come up? Yes, great. I want to do these 4 things, and I've got 15 minutes to do so, so it's going to be a little bit hectic. I apologize. The first thing I really need to say is that I'm not South African. So I'm a bit of an outsider to South African society, although I've lived here now, I've worked here for quite a long time. And you know, as somebody who is an outsider, you know, probably the most important thing for me to say is that all South Africans are, of course, really obsessed with race, it's very important to remind South Africans of this. South Africa's obsession with race goes far beyond probably, you know, even in the contemporary US, but certainly many other societies. Now, of course, there's very good historical reasons for this, right? But I think that it's important just to flag that. And that will lead me to my next topic, which is number 2, which is what does it mean to say that race is socially constructed? So I'm going to say a bit about that. Then I want to address my 3rd question. What does quantitative social science tell us about why race matters? In other words, why race matters in terms of predicting or determining or correlating with all sorts of unequal outcomes in our society, poverty, unemployment, all of the economic inequalities and so on. And then I want to end up by thinking about what is structural racism and what can social scientists help us, how can they help us understand the meaning of structural racism as the contemporary legacy of historically rooted racialized policies. All right, so, hang on a second. Okay, what does it mean to say that race is socially constructed? Now, in the academy, you know, we're always very fond of saying that race is socially constructed, and that rarely means anything more than, well, anything more precise than saying that race is not a biological construct. We don't really interrogate closely enough really what we mean by saying that race is socially constructed rather than a biological category. Right? So we reject scientific racism, but what does it mean to reject it? Where does race come from? If it then, right? So I've done work with Brazilian colleagues and taught comparative courses on race, and of course the way in which race is socially constructed in South Africa is very different to the way in which race is socially constructed in many other racially diverse and racially unequal societies, most obviously Brazil. The constructions of race, racial identities and so on, perceptions of the other, labels and identities are very different in the South African context to the Brazilian context, and again, different again to the American context. Now we do have quite a rich literature on this. We've got some really excellent work by Debbie Posel, who was here to UCT, Yvonne Erasmus, who was with you in UKZN, on the history of racial classification under apartheid. And I mean, they really have shown how even under apartheid, under the Population Registration Act, appeals procedures and so on, that there was an extraordinary cultural dimension to the way in which race classification happened. So what people thought race meant was really important in how people got classified. We've got wonderful work on the construction of coloured identity by my former colleague at UCT, Mohammed Adhikari. A wonderful thesis, which I don't think was ever published, by Dr. Clarissa Matosi at UKZN a few years ago. Wonderful thesis with a fantastic discussion on authenticity in African identity. And then more recently, UKZN's own Jerry Moraes book on racial classification after apartheid. So we've got a lot of really good work really on the way in which identities have been constructed historically, right? Particularly on the way in which they've been constructed from above by the state. Right? But of course, when we talk about social construction of identity, it's really alerting us to the fact that this is a social exercise, and that all sorts of players, including ordinary people, have an input in the way in which identities and labels are constructed. And here, of course, we have to acknowledge that in South Africa, much more, perhaps even fundamentally differently to say Brazil, cultural constructions of race have a cultural basis. That debates about authenticity for an African identity, for example, are framed with reference to African culture, right, as being something quite different to European settler immigrant culture. So there's cultural variation in South Africa, which informs the way in which racial categories are socially constructed, and of course they're politicized. So if you look at the top right of my slide, you'll see a lovely picture of Albertina and Walter Sisulu. I hope you can see the picture, and these of course were heroes of the liberation struggle. Walter Sisulu was a fascinating person because, of course, his father was a white magistrate. But Walter Sisulu identified politically and culturally as African. So he joined the African National Congress at a time when the African National Congress was racially segregated. He didn't join the colored Congress, he joined the African Congress. For him, culture and political identification were really the crucial thing in his self-identity. But we know that in practice, most South Africans employ a sort of a culturally informed understanding of race in terms of all sorts of daily interactions, and more unusual ones. For example, we have good data on marriage, and the fact of the matter is that in South Africa, if you ask most South Africans how they feel about a member of their family marrying somebody from a different racial group, almost all South Africans say, "Oh, I feel a bit uncomfortable about that." Right? Actually, and the data are pretty similar across racial groups. In other words, people who self-identify as African would say, "Yes, I'm slightly uncomfortable about somebody in my family marrying somebody who's not African." People who self-identify as white say, "I'm slightly uncomfortable about somebody in my family marrying somebody who's not white." So saying that there is this everyday consciousness of race, of racial difference and cultural difference, which all feeds into this social construction of race in our society. Of course, there's a wonderful story about Walter Sisulu and Albertina Sisulu. Walter Sisulu identified him as African. When Albertina Sisulu took her husband-to-be back to meet her family, they said to her, "You can't marry him, he's colored." But Albertina Sisulu and Walter Sisulu persevered, good for them, and had a very long and very happy marriage, although he was on Robben Island for most of that period, which was definitely not what they would have wanted. So we've got lots of studies of the way in which everyday constructions of race have feed into this. Fantastic studies, for example, of observing social interactions in universities and other places, making the same point that by and large, South Africans perceive each other in racial terms, and that informs how they interact with each other. So that's the first point that I would really like to make. I'm hoping I now go to my next slide. Right. So how do we then try and understand racialized inequalities? Well, I think often the best way of understanding them is not to ask a social scientist, because other people often have much better understanding of what it really means. So I always tell my students, good films. And the film which I often recommend to my students is the Neil Haggard's film Crash, which is American, but it's a wonderful exploration of the nuances and the complexities of race in California. I'm just reading the novel by Bernardine Evaristo, Girl, Woman, Other, which is a fascinating exploration of the meaning of race in contemporary Britain, mostly in my hometown, London. And then, of course, there are qualitative researchers such as Jonathan Jansen, who have written wonderfully insightful books. In his book Knowledge in the Blood, which is really about his experience of talking to and listening to white, black students, all sorts of students and colleagues when he was Vice Chancellor of the University of the Free State. Wonderful books. And if you really want to understand race in South Africa, I think those are the places to go. But I think the social scientists can bring something to the table here. So what do they bring? And I think what social scientists can bring is two things. Firstly, they can help us understand why race matters now. In other words, why all sorts of outcomes in contemporary society are racialized. Most obviously, employment, income, poverty, even experiences of crime, a very wide range of outcomes. So this is a little bit of a complex graph. I hope I can explain it quite quickly. Of course, it's very difficult to talk about racial inequalities without, in fact, employing a language which doesn't make much sense intellectually, which is to assume that racial groups exist. I mean, if we want to present data on racial inequalities, we have to present it in such a way that it assumes that racial groups have some meaning, which is, of course, an essentialist fallacy. But for the moment, if you'll bear with me, and let's imagine that racial groups have some kind of meaning, right? Then what can we say about this? Well, imagine if we're trying to understand why any particular outcome in society is distributed unequally. And let's call this outcome advantage. And advantage can mean all sorts of things. If you don't have very much of it, you're disadvantaged. If you have a lot of it, you're very advantaged. And on the top left, I've got a graph which shows the distribution of advantage in society. And I've imagined it's a fairly normal distribution, meaning there's a lot of people with a middling amount of advantage, but then there's some people with very little advantage, and there's some people with a lot of advantage. And this advantage here could be a proxy for income, or it could be a proxy for education, it could be a proxy for all sorts of things. But let's just imagine it's an overall factor. Now, in practice, in a context like South Africa, we're in a position more or less like the graph on the bottom left. We've got two groups, let's call them Group A and Group B. And one group is larger than the other, right? And within these two groups, advantage is distributed in different ways. So in Group B, the small group, on average, has got more advantage, right? Although, of course, there's some people in Group B with not much with less advantage, and some people with more advantage. Group A, the bigger group, most people have got less advantage, but there are some highly advantaged members of that group. Now, of course, the way we represent Group A and Group B here looks, of course, very like, say, the distribution of income amongst South Africans if we divide it by race, right? But of course, if we were to divide it a slightly different way, then the picture might look rather different. So if we were to retreat from an essentialist understanding of race, right, then the picture might look quite different. So the bottom right is to say, well, what if we were to divide these up into three groups, for example, by skin color? Now, in the USA and Brazil, there's a lot of research that suggests that actually a lot of discrimination and disadvantage is actually linked to skin color. So that, for example, the darker your skin, the more likely you are to be the victim of discrimination, right? Now, imagine we divided South African society up into three groups: Group C, Group D, and Group E, and these were divided up by skin color. Then the picture we get might be like the picture on the bottom right. Now, I say this because, of course, if we're trying to understand the nature of inequality, we have to understand that the way we frame the question is itself often the product of the way in which racial categories have been constructed in the South African case. If we were to construct them in a different way, the picture might look a bit different. Right, so that said, what can we say about the racialized nature of inequality in South Africa if we...
Sorry, Prof.
Yep.
You have 2 minutes left.
Okay, I've got 2 slides left after this. I'll be very quick.
Thank you.
What can we say about the racialized nature of inequality? So we have, firstly, the first thing we have is survey data. And survey data shows that there is, for example, a very close bivariate relationship between race, in inverted commas, and all sorts of outcomes. And by bivariate, I simply mean one variable, race, correlated with another second variable, income, for example, right? But the big question there is, what is the mechanism linking this? Because there's nothing inherent in self-identifying or being labeled by other people in a racial group and having a different distribution of income. Well, with survey data, we can interrogate those mechanisms. In other words, we can construct in social scientific terms multivariate models where we're bringing in lots of other variables such as education, networks, what Bourdieu would call cultural capital, all sorts of other things, and we can see to what extent do these variables actually drive the inequality in our outcome variable. And of course, in the South African case, we find it a lot. But once you start to introduce measures such as measures of education, networks, cultural capital, and so on, a huge part of the racialized inequality of outcomes gets explained by those variables. So what are we doing here? What we're really saying is these are intermediate stages, but for some reason, these things, education, networks, cultural capital, are distributed unevenly between different racial groups, right? And they, in turn, have knock-on effects on things like employment and income. Right? So what we're doing is we're looking at these intermediate mechanisms. Right? What we're left with in multivariate analysis then is some measure of how much of the variation by race is not explained by all of these other variables, right? And then we have to interrogate why, right? That might be because of racial discrimination. It might be for something else that we're not measuring. Right? And in fact, when we do this, we generally find that this residual, which might be racial discrimination, in other words, other people are discriminating you simply on the basis of your apparent racial category, right, is actually, of course, very, very small compared to the overall inequality that we observe in society, right? So I'm almost done. I'm going to be very quickly here. The other source of data we have is experimental data. And experimental data is really where I can talk more about this in questions and answers if anyone is interested, but where we really try and, in fact, see whether in simulated situations, whether people are, in fact, treating people from a different racial group differently to the same racial group, right? And again, well, what we find from experimental data is that actually explicit racial discrimination is far less pervasive than we would think. I can say more about that if we have time. So finally, my last slide, my last minute, my last half minute. What does this tell us? Well, of course, what we have to do is we have to then try and understand, well, why are these intermediate things like education, networks, cultural capital, why are these kinds of things unequally distributed in society? And of course, this is because of the legacy of the past. Right? If you grow up in a former Bantustan where you have access to lousy schools, right? Your parents probably didn't get to secondary school. There are no job opportunities. You have no networks into the labor market, etc., right? You are going to be severely disadvantaged, even if nobody discriminates against you on the basis of race, right? But of course, the reason many people are in this very disadvantaged positions are because of what happened primarily under apartheid and perhaps even after apartheid, but especially before and under apartheid. And when we talk about structural racism, this is how I try and make sense of it. Structural racism means that the positions that people have in society today are, of course, structured by racial discrimination, racism in the past. Now, the point about this is that you can have the reproduction of racial inequality without very much racial discrimination or racism in contemporary society. Right? Structural racism will do, in other words, the legacy of the past will reproduce racialized inequalities, even in the absence of racial discrimination or racism persisting today. Of course, if racism and racial discrimination are persisting today, and our evidence suggests that there is some, although much less than we would expect, that will, of course, further guarantee that racialized inequalities are reproduced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. From our question and answers, I've noticed that you have provoked the thinking of many of our attendees, and you will have an opportunity during Q&A to answer or respond to some of those questions. So without delaying in time, I'm going to hand our attendees over to Dr. Ella Gandhi. I'm sure that by now, Dr. Ella herself realizes that she's a household name. I remember her from the time I was about 12 or 13 years, which were many decades ago. Ella is a social worker and political activist in South Africa and has been probably her entire life. She retired after serving 2 terms in the South African Parliament representing the ANC. Presently, she works in an honorary capacity as chairperson of the Gandhi Development Trust and Phoenix Settlement Trust. And I'm sure both of those trusts are quite familiar with most of our attendees. Over to you, Dr. Ella Gandhi.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. I'll just get on with it. In this presentation, I'm going to briefly refer to activism, racialism, and racism, and how we can use our knowledge to face the present COVID-19 crisis. So firstly, let's define these terms. And I know that there are lots of other definitions, but I'm going to give you the ones that I have seen, and we can have further discussion on that. So firstly, racialism. What is racialism? It is a theory that race determines human traits and capacities. When you believe that this is a theory that race determines human traits and capacities. On the other hand, racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group. Also a belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as either inferior or superior to one another. So what is activist? An activist is a person who campaigns or works to bring about political or social change. So the 3 important elements of activism are firstly having a just cause. Secondly, you gather information about the issues. So you do research about that cause. And thirdly, that you have the courage to stand up for a just cause. So you've got to have that courage. Got to have information, courage, and a just cause. So those are the 3 elements when you start any activist program. An activist can also rally support and work towards bringing relief to people in distress and look for ways in which changes can be effectively, efficiently, and sustainably brought about in order to improve the conditions of life of people. So there are two things that an activist can do. In other words, engage in, an activist can engage in protest action against an injustice, or secondly, can engage in constructive action for building a just society. So those are the two things that an activist does. In my view, racism is as lethal a weapon as is the atom bomb. And therefore, to build a peaceful, prosperous country, we need to overcome racism. So in terms of my own experience, my first point is that during apartheid years, a concerted effort was made to separate people according to racial identity. Systematically, communities were moved to segregated areas, wherein it was hoped that they would stay and not mingle with other race groups. We were forced to attend segregated schools, universities, and other facilities. We saw the disproportionate way in which the resources of the country were being distributed to the different race groups. We saw how the apartheid government not only wanted to divide us, but also to create enmity amongst us. We were divided through the unequal treatment that they meted out to the different groups. And at the same time, people were being co-opted to perpetuate atrocities against us, the oppressed people. Our own people were co-opted to oppress us. We were born into the system, and some of us grew up to view the system as the most inhuman, unjust, and barbaric system in the world. The education system of the time, from an early age, taught children about the different races in South Africa, spoke about the achievements of the white race, so that we would believe in the theory of racial superiority. We saw that racial distinction was a learned behavior. This is what we learned, and this is what we imbibed. What was clear is that one can go with the flow and adapt to the system, or one can go against the flow and defy the system and become an activist. Defy racism, defy racialism by developing a non-racial identity. Remember, when we launched United Democratic Front, our slogan was Apartheid Divides, UDF Unites. So we went out of our way to unite with all races. The second point is that racial identification is often seen to be used by scientists, and I question it. Maybe I'm wrong, but let me explain. Recently, a group of scientists found that people of Indian and African origin tended to have a vitamin D deficiency, and that made them susceptible to COVID-19. This may be or may not be true. My contention, however, is that the same study could have been determined differently to say that lighter skin absorbs sunlight and so obtains vitamin D faster than dark skin. This would then remove the racial identity from the finding and base it on the skin color instead. I remember, for instance, many years ago, The insurance companies introduced an additional levy on premiums for people of Indian origin because they asserted that this group were prone to diabetes. They were subjected to tests while other groups were not. This, they said, was not unfair discrimination because it was based on scientific evidence. Instead of race, if they, for instance, looked at the correlation between diet and diabetes or lifestyle, example, a sedentary or a more athletic life, and diabetes, it would remove the race tag from the study and level it at a different attribute. But we are conditioned to look at things in terms of race. And so our studies are based on those factors. I believe that we need a paradigm shift because we see that race is not the determinant of particular behavior patterns. It is learning that determines these patterns. I quoted two examples that would not, I think, cause any major disagreements, but translate these examples into the numerous times that we tend to identify traits in terms of race, whether with so-called evidence or just as perceptions. This is how we build up race prejudices, and that leads to discrimination and to the after effects of discrimination. We see examples of unjust presumptions being made against race groups, eventually leading to racism, discrimination, and both injustice and exploitation of the one by the other. I'm just going to quote two examples. A child of 11, Zlata Filipovic of Sarajevo, wrote in her diary, and I quote, "Among my girlfriends, among our friends, in our family, there are Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. It's a mixed group, and I never knew who was a Serb, who was a Croat, or a Muslim. Now, politics has started meddling around. It has put an S, a capital S on Serbs, a capital M on Muslims, and a capital C on Croats. It wants to separate them. And to do so, it has chosen the worst, blackest pencil of all the pencil of war, which spells only misery and death." This was written by an 11-year-old child. Now another example from Rwanda, Immaculée Ilibagiza, and she wrote in her book, Left to Tell. And this is what she said: "In our home, racism and prejudice were completely unknown. I wasn't aware that people belonged to different tribes or races. And I didn't even hear the term Tutsi or Hutu until I was in school. The teacher yelled, 'All Tutsis, stand up now.' He was checking off names from a list. He stared directly at me. 'Immaculée Ilibagiza, you didn't stand up. Why is that?' I said, 'I don't know.' And he ordered me to get out of the class. Such was the humiliation she underwent because she didn't know which group she belonged to. These were the beginnings of the terrible genocide in Rwanda. These are bitter memories of people who have lived through oppressive regimes. My children learned about race only when they were taught to identify the different races of South Africa in school. They neither knew the terminology nor how to differentiate one from the other. As Nelson Mandela had said about violence being a learned behavior, racism too is a learned behavior, and we can unlearn it and become non-racial or a rainbow nation as Archbishop Tutu wants to see in South Africa. But we are still living with the effects of apartheid, exploitation, inequality, and poverty. COVID-19 has highlighted, on the one hand, the fact that as humans, we are all vulnerable and that we are all facing the same health dilemma. But at the same time, it was highlighted that the peril of the gross inequality and the disastrous effect of unequal access to resources that communities face. We are seeing the different patterns of racism and the effects of inequality, which is to a large extent racially based. Internationally, the wealthy countries and the poorer countries. The
Sorry,
wealthy
Prof.
and the
You have just 2 minutes left.
The wealthy elite and the poverty-stricken, mainly black masses in South Africa. These deprived masses are suffering tremendous hardships under the present conditions, but some are more severely affected than others because of lack of resources. We can look at this purely in racial terms, or we can look at it in terms of those deprived and suffering and those who are not deprived and suffering. We can look at those who are serving our people with dedication and trying to save lives, and those who are not really concerned. Neither of these groups can be classified in terms of color or race. COVID-19 reveals the one very important fact, and that is that one cannot generalize. We have seen extreme actions taken by security forces in the Floyd case. There was certainly racism involved, but what about in the case of Collins Khoza in South Africa? I refer to the remarks I made earlier that people were co-opted into the system. They are taught to be brutal, and they do not think that such brutality is wrong. Many prejudices, assumptions are based on flimsy generalizations simply because we have had a bad experience at the hands of a particular race group does not make all members of that race group bad. If only we take the race factor out by concentrating on those who do practice racism, we will be able to deal with racism decisively. Let us name and shame the ones who practice racism rather than becoming racists ourselves. Referring to slavery in Mauritania, Kevin Bales wrote, and I quote, "The criteria of enslavement today do not concern color, tribe, or religion. They focus on weakness, gullibility, and deprivation. Exploitation continues, but in another form." So those are the contentions that I have arrived at. Maybe we can have questions and discuss it further. Thank you very much.
Dr. Gandhi, I can't thank you enough for your wisdom, insight, and for putting together your experience of 80 years. And I want to say a huge happy birthday today. Yes, we can all give Dr. Gandhi a round of congratulations. And we trust that you will be around to share that wisdom with us for the next 80 years. Thank you very much. I'm also looking at the comments that are coming up and chats, and certainly your conversation or presentation has generated numerous comments as well as questions, which we will deal with during the Q&A session. Thank you once again, Dr. Gandhi. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Sipamandla Zondi, also a stalwart in the struggle, a political as well as an academic activist. And we are all looking forward to hearing his presentation. Over to you, Prof. Zondi from the University of Pretoria.
Thank you very much, Nemala, and thanks very much to the fellow panelists. It's a great honor to speak after Ella Gandhi, a living legend who has been spent all her life fighting this particular enigma we're talking about now, which is racism, hatred, and bigotry. Of course, inheriting it from her great-grandfather. It's an honor, and I'd like to greet also the people who are here. And I see that the panelists there, or all of them, I greet them. I see that the Deputy Vice Chancellor is there, a man I respect a lot, Kabazel. Thank you very much. Since my fellow panelists have covered a number of issues, it might be good for me to just pick a few issues that close gaps here and there, rather than have a whole presentation put up there. Please allow me just to pick up a few issues that we would need in order to have a conversation. Let me stimulate the conversation. The first point to make is for us to think about whether racial discrimination disrupts social cohesion. And whether that happens in the world, whether it happens in South Africa, whether it happens in other societies which have a big issue of racial discrimination. That would take us to the issue of whether social cohesion exists and it is being disrupted by an emerging problem of racial discrimination. But since racial discrimination almost in the modern world, it is the world after the late 15th century, racial discrimination in our experience, in our lives, precedes social cohesion in this particular thing. Because for it to exist, to be entrenched, there was a systematic process of what Ngugi wa Thiong'o called dismemberment. There was a complete disintegration of identities of people, a structured process of undoing whatever cohesion that might have happened before, whatever notions of human relationships that happened before, so that we do not have a past to remember which was cohesive. So we are now being asked to create new forms, a new normal, a new form of social cohesion out of the fragments of a racist, racialized, disintegrated, capitalist, colonial past, which did not die. I'll come back to that. Therefore, racial discrimination, the flare-up of racial discrimination is simply sabotaging a process of trying to recover some element of cohesion from happening, even as we're trying to do it. The second point is that racism may manifest in all parts of the world, maybe particular features in South Africa, particular features in the more former settler economy, colonies like the UK, the US, the Canada, we see it in Australia in a very big way, but it is a global problem. It is a global problem, not because it's been taken to the globe, but because the manner in which the basis on which the current global system is built was imbricated in it racism. Racism was very much part of it. It was not an accidental thing. It was not a virus that escaped while modernity was being built. No, racism was an essential part of the building of a modern world, because the idea of a modern world replaced an idea of a world before, by claiming that to be modern is to be of this particular color, of this particular culture, of this particular economic system, or of this particular education system. All of those things have a few things in common. One of them is to normalize the idea of race. The education system, the religious system, and all that, normalized an invented idea of race. Race did not exist until it was invented, and the whole global system was used to build it. And it was used to build it in order to privilege white people. And therefore, for as long as the modern system exists, its foundational logic, which is to privilege white people, white male, Christian, heterosexuals, it will, for as long as it exists, it will continue to perpetuate that unless you do something to disrupt it at a fundamental level. And therefore, all of those who fought racism in the past, if you think about it, I mean, even the Gandhis of this world, the Nehrus of this world, the Mandelas of this world, the Nkrumahs all of them understood that when you are fighting racism, you are imagining a new world. You are not fighting it to get rid of racism from a modern system in order to keep a modern system pure from it. They knew that the two are linked together. So a proper fight against racism was to reimagine the world, to reimagine everything about the world, which implies for us who in the education system to reimagine knowledge. Because if we don't reimagine the knowledge, the current knowledge reinforces racism. My students get into first year in class and they get to be told about what is important. The concepts that they are being told are important, have a particular history, have a particular geography, and they also have a race. The text they are supposed to read and use as background text come from a particular region. Only about 5 countries of the world produce those texts. The theories they're supposed to privilege come from that. All of that build that subconscious world, which is racist. So if we are to fight racism, we have to reimagine everything. The health system is the same thing. The religious system is the same thing. It has a white Jesus and a black devil. So it's the whole thing is built on it. The third point is the whole issue of racism now is becoming a huge issue again, especially in this period, not only because of COVID-19, but because in the period of COVID-19, we have been reminded about underlying tensions that are racial, especially playing out in the United States, but playing out in China as well. And remember the Africans in China and other parts of the world, in Libya, where Black people have been enslaved again, and all sorts of parts of the world, the Dalit people in India. There were issues just 4 weeks ago. We're reminded of this seeping tension that is lying underneath. Competition for space, competition for rights, competition for privileges, but also that produces despondency, desperation. It produces shattered aspirations. It also produces deferred dreams. It is people who are troubled in many ways, the people who are angry in many ways, people who are dismayed in many ways. In that context, the demon of racism also shows itself, and the fight against it also gains momentum. It is in that context that we had this one little example of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was not actually a response to what was said about Black people's lives do not matter. No, but what was experienced consistently as saying who matters and who doesn't matter. That point is very, very important because racism does exist at the level of what is spoken, but it exists a lot more at the levels of what is signified. How we signal to others about what matters and what does not matter. With the rise of the right wing, especially in the West and the US and others, that demon of racism is speaking out in signals about who matters, who doesn't matter, who is killable, who is dispensable, who can be starved and suppressed without a moral responsibility. Who is it that can be killed without your conscience, because it's a thing, it's not a person, it's not a group. That is a notion pretty much built within the global modern system, the modern global system. These whole things can be linked all together. The Occupy Wall Street, the Forest movement that we saw in South Africa, all of them are produced by a particular set of things. And that is what was well expressed by an Italian socialist, Gramsci, who talked about the period between the old dying and the new being born, and that the two are not happening at the same time. In that interregnum, we see morbid symptoms. And what we're seeing right now is morbid symptom of an old not dead and a new not being born. And people are caught between those. The racists express their racism even more. And those who oppose it need to do that. So we can't solve the problem unless we solve the transition from the old to the new, from the old nightmare to the dream that we have dreamt about. That dream is best expressed, in my view, in the words of Martin Luther King, when he says a dream of a time when he would not be judged by the color of his skin, by the content of his character. It's a sound dream. It's a great dream. It's a beautiful dream, because that is how people related with each other before they were introduced to the new mechanisms of relating with each other, which is why people of this part of the world where we are have interacted for millennia with all other peoples of the world elsewhere without actually oppressing each other and permanently placing each other in position of disadvantage. It is because they knew that we will relate with you on the basis of your humanity towards us. We will then give back humanity to you. We will earn your humanity by how you relate with us. You will not earn your humanity on the basis of the color of your skin, on the basis of moving closer to a particular skin color in order to earn your humanity. You will earn your humanity on the basis of how you relate with others, how you treat your own people, how you treat the land, how you treat the environment, and how you relate with others, and how you use the resources that are in there. That is an old dream that Martin Luther King is talking about. But the challenge with it for Martin Luther King is that he was dreaming of that world while sitting inside a nightmare, which is a current global modern world, which is inimical to that idea. In the current world with people, I'm not going to judge you on the basis of the content of your character. It just doesn't work that way. Even in the education system, I will judge you on the percentage you make, on the number of articles you produce. I will judge you on how well you do in the international platform, where international means white platform. Because international doesn't mean Malawi. It doesn't mean Sri Lanka. It doesn't mean Vietnam. International means Western. So I will judge you on the basis of your proximity to that. If that world accepts you, we will call you an international scholar. But if the world of the Pacific Island accepts you, you will be a regional scholar. The fifth point I wanted to make is that there has been an international consensus that you need an international response to this problem, which is why we had the Third World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances in 2001 in Durban at Tegwin. And it produced the Durban Declaration and a program of action, which was a wide-ranging set of actions that could be taken in the meantime to get rid of the problem on a global scale, because it was understood that you cannot get rid of a problem on the basis of actions you take nationally, you take in a province, you take in an institution. It's a global problem. That was it. And countries were required to develop national plans to implement that world consensus. Remember that consensus was simply basic things that were done, not the most ideal things. Very basic things that needed to be done, like having a race hate law, having a law that outlaws racism and all of those kinds of things, racial discrimination in the workplace, all of those basic things we're asked to do. But very few countries have developed that national plan. Even South Africa only deposited the national plan in 2018, which is 17 years after the declaration. It took us 17 years to work out what is our national plan against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. Now, South Africa is a very idealistic country. It takes these things very seriously. If South Africa takes this long, you will have to tell me what you think other countries, especially countries in the West, especially countries in other parts of the world, would take to deal with this thing. The seventh point is that we have also developed a national consensus that says racism is out. We have a national constitution, Bill of Rights, it's all the nice things. But we're increasingly realizing now that without fundamentally restructuring society, without fundamentally restructuring the relations between people, without fundamentally disrupting the legacies that continue to live to this day, the statues that we see and the statues that we do not see, without redefining and redreaming our nation, all those things that are in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights will only take us to an extent, but will not help us do that. And that is why there's an African saying that says, borrowed waters won't quench your thirst. Finding these ground norms, these that are called best practice, they look very good. You will adopt them and everybody will praise you have the best constitution in the world. But it still would not take you where you want to go. Because you need a change in mindset. The change in mindset is my 8th point, which is one for last point, would require us redreaming our world, would require us re-socializing people. So people will go to school and to university, to college, not only just to acquire information on the basis of which they will get qualification so that they can get a job. They're going to all of these things to come to terms with themselves as human beings so that they will lose themselves as racial beings. They're going to education to be re-educated rather than to be re-indoctrinated with the ideas of modernity about who we are. They're going to education to gain their confidence rather than to lose confidence in who they are. They will go into the education system in order to be empowered in order that they may change society, rather than be empowered in order simply just to acquire a house, a car, which is owned by a bank. So education will be true empowerment rather than what we have now, which is the colonial education, which we inherited and renamed it, which is designed to reproduce the old problem that we are, which is why we reproduce the past. The education is very effective in doing that. It is based on hierarchies. I always ask my students whether they wondered why we value people's contribution in education, their performance in learning, using a hierarchy from A to K, whatever, or from number 1 to number 15. We don't value them on the basis of their ability to participate in a cycle of people. You value them on their ability to move up a hierarchy so that they occupy the top at the expense of the bottom. Fundamentally problematic, the logic that we use, how we score, how we grade. The very idea of grading and the way we grade it reproduces the system. Even if we are saying we're decolonizing our education now, but we decolonize and use the logic that is colonial, and borrowed waters won't quench your thirst. The people of the Turkana Valley in South Sudan have said this for a long time, that however long a log of wood stays underwater, it just does not become a crocodile. However much you put all of these things and you do them for a long period of time, if you don't change the logic, the results would be the same. Lastly, I suggest that the redreaming of the world, which involves, the nature involves at least 4 quick things. It involves a frank conversation about what fundamentally is wrong, rather than just what is wrong. What fundamentally is wrong? What fundamentally reproduces racism? Not just what produces it, you will see separate things, but at a fundamental level about the creating of what we call a global village, which we have now. What causes it? What undermines the dream of social cohesion? Because talking is not wrong, because talking helps us redream the world. I know people talk about talk shops. I better be in a talk shop, shopping for ideas, than sit somewhere implementing ideas I never shopped for. The second thing is that redreaming requires correcting the past, committing to concretely dismantle the statues, not only the physical statues, but also the invisible statues. Thirdly, it means us to decide what is the route going forward. Is it multiracialism? Is it non-racialism? Or is there a third way? Is there a fourth way? Are there other ways? Can we choose many ways at the same time? What are we choosing to do? Before we say we are disappointed by what we do, what did we choose to do? Did we choose to do? Or 1994 was simply a compromise where the old coexist with the new, and therefore there was no choosing happening. Lastly, we need a new education, an education that is meant to produce a new citizen that is going to join society, that will transcend the fiction of race, that can avoid bigotry, the one that can realize the dream of Martin Luther King and others, the one that socializes people to place value on their human character, on their human value, on their human thing. In doing so, I want to echo what Ma'am Ella Gandhi said earlier on. We must be mindful of ourselves getting trapped in the fiction of race while we are fighting it, so that we don't reproduce it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Siphamandla. If this was a popularity contest, I'd like to inform you that your ratings have broken the ceilings. And that's based on the comments and questions that are coming through in the Q&A chat. And I mean that seriously, that your presentation has provoked our attendees and participants to think in different ways, to think about race in various ways, creative ways. So your discourse has been excellent. I'd really like you to have a look at the chats that have come through. Thank you so much for that. With that, we are on to our last but not least of all, Pastor Michelle Tryon. Sorry, Michelle. Michelle, of course, has long ties with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, having graduated as a student in the 90s. And of course, I think her special presence here today is her link with communities. Besides being a pastor, she has been and continues to be an activist, and I think an activist in many facets. So Michelle's voice today is really critical for us because we see the church as a really important institution in terms of social cohesion. And I think she's going to build on what Professor Zondi has just laid for us. How do we bring people together in a way that does not discriminate, in a way that does not make us feel oppressed, inferior, superior, etc.? Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Professor Galkal, and thank you to the university for having me. And to this panelist, I really feel so blessed. I feel so honored. I actually can't believe that I'm on a panel with the people that I honor and respect so very much. So thank you so much for having me. To all the attendees, thank you so much for participating and being part of this powerful conversation that we are having. I'd like to share my screen so I can go into my presentation, if that's okay, and then I can lead from my presentation. let me see if I can get to my presentation. So,
So we can see it.
okay, you can see it. Okay, excellent. I can't open it into presentation mode because I just want to be able to guide myself onto each next slide, if you don't mind. So basically,
It's fine.
For now, it's fine. Okay, thank you. So for today, our topic is racial discrimination, a covert disruptor of social cohesion. So this is one of the press release articles. So basically, I'm going to be talking about racial discrimination within the religious context, because obviously, as we said, I'm a minister of religion, I'm a pastor, but I'm also a social activist. But I'm going to really be leaning into the religious context and how racial discrimination is seen or experienced within this context. And then obviously, from my own personal experiences, within the religious context, I want to look at some of the definitions and how these definitions lead us to racial discrimination as a covert disruptor of social cohesion. I also, towards the end, just want to talk about maybe a few pointers that can help us identify these definitions, because a lot of times the definitions are taking place on a subconscious level, and we don't realize that we are internalizing some of the definitions and the meanings that are attached to these definitions. So I want to move quickly to my next slide, and that's basically our religious beliefs and values have a major impact on how we give meaning to things. It ultimately impacts on our thoughts, our words, our actions, our values, our character, and as human beings, and ultimately they become our destiny. I love this quotation. It says, watch your thoughts because they become words. Watch your words because they become your actions. Watch your actions because they become our habits. And when we watch our habits, they become our character. And we watch our character because ultimately it becomes our destiny. And so what I'm saying here is that racial discrimination starts somewhere. And for us, it starts in our belief systems. And the religious sector has, or the religious context has a major role to play in how we believe and how we interact with things and how we value things, how our characters are formed. And so the religious context, or the religious sector, plays a major role in dealing with and how we deal with racial discrimination. Professor Zondi alluded to this. We see within a religious context, specifically within the Christian context for which I belong to, Black really represents to us within the religious context as something that is evil and something that we don't like, or something we don't want, because Black always seems to define the devil or the evil. And then on the white side of the religious context, Jesus is this white representation to us. So the white is always seen as something that is pure. It is always seen as something that we want, something that we like. And so I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with the colors, but the meanings we attach to the colors subconsciously translate and lead us to then defining one another, because all around us, as we look around, we are defined by the color of our skin. Whether we like it or whether we don't, we are defined by the color of our skin. It's sad that that's still happening, but that is the point. And so our basis of what we are seeing in the religious context and what is good and what is evil, it's going to affect how we define each other, because we are defined by the color of our skin when we're dealing with racial discrimination. For a long time in the Christian circle, I thought the whole Bible was white. And I've been raised in a Christian circle. And I thought Jesus was white, everyone was white. And I struggled with that because I couldn't find my own identity in something like this. I struggled with where do I belong? How does God relate to me? How can it just be a Bible full of white people? And so as I moved along, I began to do my own studies. I went to go and see, why would our Creator, our God, always be referring to white people. You know, everything looked white, even though, yes, there was Jews and stuff like that, but they were light skinned, they weren't dark skinned. And as I studied, and obviously, you know, in my quest to find my own identity and my relatability in the Bible and with my Creator, with my source, with my God, I found that the Bible, there was racial discrimination right in the Bible. And so we saw racial discrimination right at the beginning with Moses. Moses was one of our most powerful lawgivers of history. And he married a black woman, Zipporah. And there are countless numbers of black people that are in the Bible. But people and the way things, and I think this goes right back to colonialism and the way religion is portrayed to us. It's based in colors, it's based in race, it's based in the color of your skin, it's based on your gender. So there's always this discrimination that is so covert, it's so undercover, and it separates us. And it is a strong disruptor of social cohesion between us. And so I had to go in and have a look at these things and see, how does this impact me? How does it impact my understanding of self, my understanding of others? How does it impact my psychology? How does it impact our sociology? And so it became a quest for me to dig much deeper into it. And so when I looked at our Creator, I saw that there was a very willful intention for diversity and for uniqueness. Everything that our Creator did was to encourage diversity, was to encourage uniqueness. If we look at our fingerprints, they are all different. If we look at the colors around us. And Mahatma Gandhi said, our ability to reach unity in diversity will be the beauty and the test of our civilization. And I really believe that that is the truth for us now. And our unity is our strength, and our diversity is our power. There are countless research that has been done to demonstrate that when you put people together that think the same, that act the same, that are the same, it is less productive and less powerful than when you put a group of people together that have a diverse view, because then you see things from a completely different point of view. It becomes rich, it becomes powerful, it becomes more meaningful. And so diversity is our power. And if we can achieve the unity within our diversity, that is where our power lies. I heard a statement quite a while back, and the statement said, we've got to move away from tolerance. Because tolerance is, I just tolerate you. I got to deal with you, so I got to have you. So we're dealing with racial discrimination. So we have the different races getting put together, and we kind of just are trying to tolerate one another. But when we move away from that and go back to source, go back to what our Creator's source was for us, and his whole willful intention for diversity and uniqueness, then we will understand that we require each other's diversity. I require your uniqueness. I value it accordingly. But if you tolerate it, then you are going to you're not going to value it, because I got to tolerate it. But when I understand that I require this diversity, I require this uniqueness, then I will value it accordingly. As I said, our power is unity within our diversity. Prof. Gopal, am I still with you?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. I just got, I saw it's unstable on my side, so I wasn't sure. Okay, so where do we go to from here? The first thing is, you know, in the Christian circles, we have this thing that says, it's not my brother, it's not my sister, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. And I think that if we are going to have honest, meaningful dialogues, then we've got to understand that we have all been socialized in a particular way when it gets to racial discrimination. And we've all been impacted by it, because we are We are social beings. So we've been socialized in a very particular way about race and this division based on the color of our skin. So we each need to go and be aware of our own internal bias. We all need to be self-reflective human beings at this point. We all need to be aware of how has this impacted me? Because let's start at ground zero. I call it ground zero. I start with me. And then we'll move to macro and build systems and programs and all of those sorts of things. But for me personally, how has racial discrimination and me being defined based on the color of my skin, how has that impacted me? How have my perceptions been formed? How have my beliefs been impacted? And when we start exploring that, I remember quite a few years ago, we were flying to, I think from Joburg to Durban, something like that. And in those early days, I think it was the first time we were having a black pilot. And the rumbling between in the plane, and you could feel the insecurity that because now there's a black pilot and not a white pilot, and what they've done to people. And the whole internal bias and perceptions and ideologies came to the fore as people either got fearful, oh my gosh, a black person is going to be the pilot, or other people were like, oh, he has a breakthrough, this is wonderful. And so these sort of things started coming up in an open environment like that. But I think that it is important for us to all be self-reflective and let us be aware of how has racial discrimination impacted me? How has it impacted myself? How has it impacted my psyche? How has it impacted the way I believe? How has it impacted the way I look at myself? For me, in the religious context, I had to look at how does me being a Christian impact me as a person of color when this Bible at that point looked all white to me? How do I relate? How do I find? So that self-reflection is something that is absolutely important that all of us have to do. And if all of us are honest first with ourselves, then I think that we can start being honest with each other. The second point I want to make about our power in diversity is that every one of us has a role to play. I've got a role to play maybe in the religious sector, or you have a role to play in the educational sector, or wherever you are, in our homes, internally, we have a role to play to deal with this issue of racism and racial discrimination. When we look at our bodies, we have our eyes, we have our ears, we have our heart, we have our lungs, and all of these things are completely different, yet so needed, so required, so valuable to make our body be what our body is supposed to be, to function in the perfection that it's been created to function. And so likewise, as we sit here, as we have taken time out just to start thinking about this impact of racial discrimination and how it divides us as human beings, what role do you play? What role do I play? And how am I going to contribute to the dismantling of this evil of racism? We have got a role to play, and I can't wait for my brother and my sister, or they must make a plan, or they must provide a solution. It starts with me, and it starts on that level. And as each one of us come to the party to play our role, we are going to begin to see some good fundamental change taking place. On my last slide now, I really believe a new day has dawned upon us. I believe the time is now. And I believe that every one of us has been hurt by racial discrimination. That's in my heart. None of us can stand there and say, well, I haven't been hurt by this thing. This thing has hurt us and hurt generations before us and hurt our generation, and will have an impact on generations to come. But we've got to start somewhere. And how do we start? We've got to start by healing. We've got to heal our minds. And I love what Prof. Zondi was talking about. This is a mind thing. In the scriptures, it says that transformation is by the renewing of our minds. We've got to get rid of the old and relearn things and get transformed in our minds. And then we're going to see meaningful change. But we can only heal when we acknowledge the pain. We can only heal until we recognize the wounds. What has racial discrimination done to us as human beings? And it starts with me. What has it done to me? And how do I heal? And how do I contribute to the healing process that then takes place amongst us as a society, as a community? So we got to take responsibility to heal and be healed. And it's, the healing process, I believe, is going to be a lifelong journey, because we have been in this racial, this evil of racism has been with us for so long. And so the whole healing process is going to have to be so psychologically, it's going to be in all our different sectors and industries, like education, in the religious sector, how we define things, how we attach meaning to things, how we monitor how things are being impacted on us, and all of these sorts of things. But every part of us is going to have to be part of this healing journey that each one of us have got to embark on. And then the last thing is that the point that I want to make is that we need to be open to each other. We need to be willing to suspend our views from time to time so I can listen. My brother used to always share something and he used to say, listen, listening. So I can suspend my ideologies. I can suspend my bias. I can suspend, let me hear you. Let's listen to one another. And I think once we open ourselves to each other, we may say things wrong in the process of navigating through this. We may trigger one another. We may, we may say the wrong things, and it may not be perfect as we navigate our way. But let's stay linked into each other. Let's stay committed to each other, to be open, to listen, and as we listen, we will be heard. And then let's make space for every one of us to sit at this table of discussion and see how we can forge a whole new, as Prof. Zandi said, we imagine a whole new society, a new community, a new human race. And I believe, and I conclude with this, that I really believe that love and forgiveness will be at the cornerstone of our way forward. Love, we're going to love God, our source, our creator. Obviously, I'm a pastor, so I like to bring that in so spiritually. We're going to love my neighbor as I love myself. So I have to love myself in the context of my spirituality and find my identity with my source, with my creator. And the more I get healed, the more I release, the more I forgive, I'm able to extend that love and that forgiveness to those that are around me. So love and forgiveness, letting go of things that hold us, like Prof. Zandi was talking about, the colonial way of doing things. We got to let some things go and be open to explore and find new ways of doing stuff that is for us. The evil of racism is completely abolished. I trust that I have been of some value. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. You have been of great value. The important messages for me are, for example, the healing. And I think the TRC should not have been an event. It should have been a process. For South Africans, the TRC started the healing, and because we lost it or we stopped it on the way, I think part of that, part of the consequence is that we're still having to deal with issues of race, racism, and various forms of discrimination. I also like the fact that you mentioned reflection, and it begins with us, or me as an individual. And I think the big thing for me is, when I relate to you, am I relating to you from the basis of race, or from the basis of one human being to another? And I think sometimes we are not alert to the fact that there's some covert form of racism that's either coming through from the receiver or from the sender. So I think those are really important discussions as well. And you've raised some really important thoughts and ideas. So with that, we're going to take some questions. We started off with over 200 participants. So that means we have many questions and many comments. So I'm going to try and be as systematic as possible. and I'm going to call out some names. So if you would please ask your question again, or ask your question, and the presenter, I will call out the presenter who the question is for, and if you could please provide a response. And if you don't want to, you could hand that particular question over to one of the other presenters. So starting off with Jeremy, if Ruth Gopi is still participating, will you please ask Jeremy your question? I don't know if Ruth is around, but basically what she wanted to know is whether workplace discrimination on a racial basis, how does one report workplace discrimination? Racially based workplace discrimination. Does one of the other panelists want to take that question? Or Jeremy is there? Or we don't know if Ruth is there. But that's for you, Jeremy. Will you please take that question?
I'm afraid I just don't know the answer. I'd imagine that you need to go to the CCMA. One route to be the CCMA, the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration. I mean, I don't know if your workplace has got internal procedures for dealing with this. So, for example, many large companies and universities have their own internal processes, and you should presumably use internal processes first, right? But if there are no internal processes, or the internal processes are exhausted, you need to go externally, then you probably need to talk to a labour lawyer or to the CCMA, or I mean, I would have thought those would be the routes, but I'm afraid I'm not a discrimination lawyer, so I can't help with that.
Okay, thank you for that, Jeremy. I hope that Ruth has heard the response, or she will listen to the YouTube later on. There's another question by Anonymous, and this person wants to know if one of the panelists can help him or her understand the definition of African. And she asks, or he asks, is it Black? If so, does it mean that all other racial groups are not African? So if I may repeat.
So that one? Can I ask
okay.
that one?
Yes, please, sure.
I like the definition given by Kwame Nkrumah, who says an African is not the one who was born in Africa, but is the one for whom Africa was born in them. The one who acquired a consciousness in themselves, then make them embrace and self-identify as African, and make them love Africa enough to do everything they need to do to get rid of the challenges Africa faces and to redeem Africa in the face of the world. Because I can't be born in Africa physically, but be born in Australia mentally. So I'm physically in Africa, but my psychology and consciousness is in Australia. That doesn't help me. And that's a challenge that gets posed to the universities and the schools and all that. What kind of an African we are producing in class? Are you producing one who is dismembered with their body and their physical look, looking like they come from Africa, but with their mindset, their outlook, their theories, their paradigms, their mind coming from the United States? That produces what Schiller Marx called ambiguous people, people with double identity. W.E. Du Bois talk about people who exist as a problem because they have an appearance which contradicts their consciousness. So an African for me is one whose consciousness is born African and as identified with Africa and what Africa is, and Africa as a global space, not just Africa as this piece of land that we see. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Zondi. I think you've really educated all of us. And I think part of the discussions or the conversations that came up spoke about the psychology of racism. And perhaps in some ways you alluded to that in terms of who do we want to emulate? Born in Africa, wanting to emulate the West, Australia, North America, etc. So I think that's an excellent response. The next question wants to know, and I think this is probably Jeremy's question, but I'm sure anyone could take it. There's a professor who wants the panelists to clarify the use of the term obsession in reference to South Africans and race, bearing in mind that obsession can be healthy or unhealthy.
Perhaps I might also just add on to Professor Zondo's comments as well about what meaning of African. I mean, I think normatively, we're all attracted to the idea that people should be able to self-identify. And if people self-identify as African, or if they identify with Africa, then that's a pretty good approach. Of course, we live in a context, though, where the way that other people see us makes a big difference to our lives in many ways, and the way that the state classifies us continues to be really important. Jerry Morea's book on racial classification is really dedicated, of course, to this, the way in which the post-apartheid state has, without legislation, continued to classify us indirectly in very many ways. And this is a minefield. So, for example, take affirmative action at a university, right? Universities, quite rightly, I think, practice affirmative action in order to, or universities like my own, University of Cape Town, in order to make sure, in order to promote a more diverse student body, and to give students opportunities that they might otherwise not be able to access because they've been to, for example, disadvantaged schools. So the university quite rightly practices affirmative action. But what criteria would you use to do so? Now, you know, in practice, we know that the state tries to fit everything into racial boxes, right? Are there other ways of doing it? Well, in Brazil, universities try to use self-identification, right? And then, of course, you have the problem. Well, what do you do when an apparently advantaged, apparently white applicant says that he is in fact black? And so in the Brazilian case, universities had to set up committees to scrutinize the self-labeling that applicants made in their applications, because in some way, because it was believed that in fact, some applicants would have incentives to be dishonest, right? So the self-identification is a huge problem here in terms of things like universities. Now, University of Cape Town has partly got around this problem by saying, well, we're not going to pay so much attention to things simply like your racial classification with that, whatever that means. We're going to look at other things. For example, were any of your parents classified as black under apartheid, right? What kind of a school did you go to, right? Do any of your parents have university degrees? And these are ways, in fact, of trying to measure, if you like, structural racism, and the way in which structural racism shapes the opportunities and the lives of individual people now, more than 25 years after 1994, right? But these are, of course, very controversial. So this is a bit of a minefield. The question that was asked to me very quickly was about obsession, and I used the word obsession really to refer to what other people have called the normalization of race. Racial classification is normalized in a way in South Africa way beyond most other parts of the world, I think. And by normalized, I mean it's not just normal in the sense of commonplace, that people routinely use racial labels to describe themselves and other people, but it's also normalized in a normative sense, that it's seen as being, for the most part, unproblematic morally and ethically to live life and interact with other people on the basis of these racial categories. And I completely concur with the very eloquent words of Dr. Gandhi, Pastor Tryon, Professor Zondi, on the imperative of going beyond the normalization of racial difference. We can celebrate diversity, but the idea that we have to normalize difference and accept this as being morally sound and a rightful part of our everyday life, that's a disaster.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Professor Ernst Buchan, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, had sent us a list of questions, but because of time, I'm going to pose one of his questions, and that is the color of our skin the main or the only determinant in separating us? And I'm sure he means as human beings or as people. So is the color of our skin the only determinant in separating us?
Shall I answer that?
Yes, sure.
Okay. I spoke about Sarajevo. There was discrimination there between the different groups. They look all the same. If you look at Israel and Palestine, you look at a person from Israel and a person from Palestine, you won't be able to differentiate in terms of color or looks, but they have different religions, and that has posed a problem. So you find different things on which people discriminate against each other, and largely it is a question of the person who has power, and power comes in many ways: physical power, money power, backing from other governments and things like that. The person who has power and those who are powerless. And what we see in South Africa is exactly the same thing. You have the powerful and the powerless, and that's where the discrimination arises. And therefore we need to go beyond race and look at why is it that certain people are more powerful than others, and how can we change that? So, yeah.
Thank you, Ella. I see that Prof. Buchan is in the audience and his hand is up. I'd like to give him an opportunity to ask some of the other questions.
Needs to unmute.
Shakila, we need to unmute him, please.
He needs to unmute. He's muted himself.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. The major question I tried to pose, and it's quite a long one, is actually what about the cultural differences defined by, and here I'm quoting my book, Universal Change, the points of different languages we speak. One is complicated, the other one is simple. Afrikaans is a very simple language. Our norms and expectations, what you expect from our colleagues. Our sense of values according to which we decide what is important in life. Also our beliefs, which most people in our society consider to be real and true. Also our roles defining a person's tasks or duties in our society. Is he just working for himself, or is he just working for the poor? And also our social collectives, referring to our feeling of togetherness. In other words, these are all culturally dictated forms. And although I very much enjoyed Professor Zondi's presentation, I couldn't help but a film that I saw many, many years ago, which said, "Stop the world, I want to get off." And that's an ideal slogan for all failures. If the rest of the world has different cultures and my culture doesn't fit into it, yes, stop the world, I want to get off. It's unrealistic to think that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Ernest. So I want to make a remark at this point, and it reminds me of the spirit of Ubuntu. I am because you are. And I think when we start speaking and acting in racialized ways, then it undermines the spirit of Ubuntu. And I think South Africa in 1990 decided that in the early 90s, decided that we want to be a rainbow nation. And I think when we begin to undermine the very cornerstone of what we had built through discriminating against each other, then we're losing our spirit of Ubuntu. The other observation that I've made, and I've made over the years, is that sometimes we believe that Ubuntu is for a particular grouping of people. And I really hope that all of us will get under the same tent and realize that Ubuntu is for every South African. With that, I want to know if there are any other questions, because mostly we had comments. I see we've got one from Justin Pringle, who speaks about education. So he says to Jeremy, thanks for your presentation. I'd like to hear more about your multivariate model. And he says, if I understand correctly, you have developed a stochastic model, I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, to explore the effects of race on advantage and disadvantage. You define advantage in terms of education, etc. Could you play with the model parameters in a type of Monte Carlo simulation to explore what would need to be changed to address the structural inequality as a type of boundary condition of your model? That's quite a mouthful. I hope you heard all of it, Jeremy.
Let me try and answer it in non-technical terms. I mean, I think what Justin is asking really is he's saying, okay, that I can present a fairly schematically a model which suggests that much of the inequality, the racialized inequality that exists in contemporary South Africa can be explained in terms of inequalities in things like education, most obviously education, but other things, networks and so on, right? And so, and what are the implications of this then for what can be done? Well, I mean, I think that we can see that quite clearly, that if we really want to address racism, race, and the normalization of race, perhaps even a normalization of racism in South Africa today, then we really have to do something about the very deep inequalities that exist in our society, and particularly inequalities of opportunity, that very large numbers of people, who are almost all classified by the state and others as Black or African, right, face appalling opportunities because they live in areas with bad schools, with no jobs, with very poor access to the labour market, etc., etc., etc. Right? And I think if we don't address the socioeconomic inequalities, educational inequalities in our society, then we're not going to actually make much progress in addressing how South Africans see each other and others. We're not actually going to be able to make much progress in terms of fostering a culture of Ubuntu if we have such deep inequalities in our society. And really there, we actually have to ask some very demanding questions of the government, of the state, right? I mean, we have a state which continues to normalize racial difference through its classificationary practices, as Jeremy Morais has shown very clearly. We also have a state which shows an extraordinary disregard for the poor, the poorest half of the population in our country. I've been working recently on something which is quite far removed in some ways from today's discussion, which is how the state has responded to the lockdown over the last 3 or 4 months. And I do a lot of work on social policy, social protection, feeding schemes, and so on. And the extraordinary thing is that under the lockdown, the state has distributed less food to poor people than it did before the lockdown, right? We live in a society where the state is completely failing the poorest half of the population. That the state is doing very little about schools in poor areas. It's doing very little about access to jobs. It's doing very little about getting resources and food in emergency situations to poor areas. And unless that changes, I fear that we can talk about Ubuntu as much as we like, but we're not actually going to make much progress.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I hope that Prof. Ernest was happy with that. Oh no, it was somebody else. But I think this is quite an interesting question, and it's posed to any one of the panelists. The anonymous attendee wants to know, can a Black person act racistly against another Black person?
I'm happy to give an answer to that. Sorry, Dr. Gandhi, after you.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think, you know, when we talk about racism, it means also ethnicity, it means any kind of difference. So there are lots of differences that people can look at. And one of the biggest ones that leads to this unfair discrimination is the whole class issue, where you find that one person is poorer than the other. And that's where most of the exploitation comes in. It's because of the poverty of the person that the exploitation arises. And I think if we look at history, you know, we see how did the slavery start? How did indenture, for instance, why was indenture possible? It was because the people were poor in India. They were impoverished. They were leading a successful life. But the British colonization led to impoverishment in India. And then because of their poverty there, they were willing to look for other, you know, greener pastures, not knowing what the indenture system is going to do to them. In the same way, slavery and other things. So it's the poverty. Your weakness arises from the poverty. And so that is a class differentiation. So it could be a Black person who is rich and a Black person who is poor, and the rich Black person can exploit the poor Black person. That is what, I don't know whether you call that racism, but it's an exploitation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gandhi. Jeremy, do you want to add something to that point?
Well, I completely agree with Dr. Gandhi, but I would add a quick point. A few years ago, students and I conducted research in what are often called mixed neighborhoods in Cape Town, meaning that they are not monoracial in South African terms. And we asked lots of people. The first question we asked is, who lives here? And it was a sort of open question, and people could say anything they liked, like men, women, old people, young people. But of course, almost everybody answers that question with racial categories. And so the typical answer would be something like this. All sorts of people live here. We have Black people, colored people, we have even some white people, and then there's African people, meaning Zimbabweans, most part, and Somalis, right? All races live here. And I think many people from the rest of Africa in South Africa report that they feel that the xenophobia that they are subjected to is something which is a very, if it's not racism, it's something very similar to racism. xenophobia is pretty close to being a form of racism. And we could have a semantic argument as to exactly where the boundaries of racism are. But I think the kinds of prejudice, right, which exist in society certainly extend across the whole of our society.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So we have a minute left and I'd like to round up. I'm just thinking, after having listened to the various presentations and reading through the comments, perhaps we should shift the debate from racism to discrimination. I think sometimes, and I think Ella pointed that out when she spoke about class, you know, a Black person of a higher socioeconomic class discriminating or behaving in a racist fashion towards someone of a lower socioeconomic class. So perhaps sometimes we get muddled and we obfuscate the issue of discrimination, and we lump it in one basket and we call it racism. And it may not necessarily be racism. So I think it may be important to untangle that, to disaggregate it, and to find out what is it really? Is it discrimination? Is it coming from a space of deep hatred for what the so-called African, colored, Indian, white person? So, I mean, I don't know how easy that would be able to determine, but perhaps the future conversations can focus around some of those particular variables as well. I want to thank the presenters firstly, the organizers are the DVC, Professor Mkhize, but most importantly, I think the attendees. When I look at the kind of comments that you have made and the questions you've asked, you have greatly enriched this webinar. I'm hoping that the one thing I'm certain of is that we will have this loaded onto YouTube. What I'm not certain of is whether we will be able to compile, to curate the questions and the comments and make those available, because I think that they are rich and will in some way benefit some of us, maybe at a time when we're thinking about discrimination or we're thinking about race. This could be our own encyclopedia as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Please do have a safe evening.